So I'm going to pull back the lens a little bit about what we think about freedom, because it seems to me that when we conceptualize freedom and talk about and think about it, we first, in the West, connect it very closely to democracy, and we typically connect it to the Age of Enlightenment that Professor Sims spoke about. This is the kind of moment where Europe starts to think about freedoms, liberty, and so on, and the world of some of the scholars you've been hearing about, from Hobbes, Locke, Hume, J.S. Mill, etc., all seems very persuasive. But I think we need to make sure that we are bench testing that correctly, because since humans learnt to read and write and commit ideas to clay tablets, to bamboo strips, interests in lots of different things that we're interested in today, justice, equity, and so on, have been very consistent. But freedom is one of the fundamental questions that scholars were thinking about a long time before those clever people in the British Isles, and even some of them in Germany and Sweden, etc., wherever you're from, were thinking about. And I think that that is really important, because our idea that the West is the cradle of freedom and democracy is categorically wrong. I mean, we raid the classical texts for ideas about democracy, but the first thing that one should learn about the democratic traditions of ancient Athens is that democracy proves to fail as a political system. It's short-lived, doesn't last very long, but is blown out of disproportion by later scholars in the 17th, 18th century onwards, particularly in Europe, raiding Greece for all sorts of different cultural and intellectual hinterlands that look and sound like that they are important. But when you start to think about freedoms in the ancient Chinese tradition, and I know that Dr. Fraser and Professor Strauchs will talk about that tomorrow, or maybe haven't I missed that, but there are specific questions around what does freedom mean in the Chinese traditions, whatever China means, I mean all the East Asian traditions, likewise in South Asia, and in Babylon, Mesopotamia, where there's an enormous amount of questioning about how free humans are. It sort of feels wrong to say humans rather than man, but it is, that's how we do it. How people are free. To what extent are people's choices dictated by cosmological forces or the divine? To what extent are choices limited or shaped by the natural environment? To what extent are social structures, family units, etc., responsible for giving or taking away opportunities? These are things that have been of interest for thousands of years. And so I'm going to talk about the modern world, but even in the Justinian Code, the great Byzantine emperor, in fact, Roman emperor, but we call him Byzantine emperor, in the 530s, codifying laws. One of the first elements that Justinian wanted to write about was about defining what freedom means. And Justinian's definition, or those who compiled it for him, was that freedom is the natural power of doing what we please unless prevented by force or by law. And that sounds plausible, simple, straightforward, and a precedent for the kinds of things that we've been talking about yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So, of course, the key question then is, what is force? Who wields it, and in what capacity? What is justice? How does the law intersect with the provision of justice, and who provides it? And, of course, those are highly subjective in terms of how we think about the past, the present, and I suspect the future. So, for example, when we think about the free world, we allied that absolutely with the West, which itself is a clumsy, difficult term, and we could spend a long time arguing about it, which none of us want to do. But we see ourselves in the West as a beacon of the kind of values that we think we need to defend, right? And the metrics that we use to measure those are ones which are layered onto other people in the world. So, for example, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of race, gender, etc., etc. And we think of these as archetypally and uniformly Western values, with some good reason, but almost all of those are extremely recent in our European history. So for those of you who know about parts of the world I work on, women in Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan, which are by no means the most enlightened countries in the world, allowed women to vote before Great Britain did. My own universities in the United Kingdom, we've just passed 100 years of allowing women to take degrees. They were allowed to study the subjects, but some of the things that we think of as being fundamental ways of trying to teach lessons to the past are quite new for us. So claiming the high ground, I think, for working about what those freedoms mean is important, partly because in almost all the countries that I work in, from Turkey going eastwards towards the Pacific, there is pushback, and there has been for the last 2 or 3 decades. It's been one of the major themes, not just about the rise of authoritarianism, but a pushback to the idea that the West is trying to force lessons onto other people, and that the conforming, those ideas about freedoms are ones that should be given and forced rather than learned. So those ideas, I think, about freedom are extremely important to try to work out what we even really mean. The West, meaning the United States, Australia, settler colonies. It's no coincidence, I think, that those places that were seeded out of global trade routes and out of global expansion of Europeans are the ones which have been the most at the forefront of trying to protect what these freedoms mean. And I'll say a bit about that too. But just to sort of take a step back, you will know that in the US Constitution, the preamble says that the purpose of the Constitution, the purpose of the United States, is to establish justice, to provide for common defence, and to promote general welfare. And if those are achieved, then the secure blessings of liberty will flow. Liberty and freedoms is a product of good governance and of fair governance, right? For our Frankophone and our French friends here, those important words of liberté, égalité, and fraternité are the binding DNA of what France thinks of itself. However imperfectly those are shared down. And of course, we do things a little bit more bluntly in the United Kingdom. So as we go back to rule of Britannia, we'll say we'll never be slaves, which effectively means we will always be free. But other people do something similar. So here we go. This is the second paragraph of the Constitution saying that man and his rights are the supreme human value. The recognition, observance, and protection of the rights and freedoms of men and citizens shall be the obligation of the state. And that is the second paragraph of the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Then we have another state which says that it is a fundamental right, Article 35 and 36, for citizens to enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and the freedom of demonstration. And that is from the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, that also declares in the following paragraph that the freedom of citizens of the People's Republic of China, of all citizens, is inviolable. Inviolable. I've had not enough coffee. Can't be violated. So these ambiguities, I think, mean that when we think about freedom, it's very much in the eye of the beholder. And were we to have representatives of the Chinese Communist Party here, and we may well, unknown to us, have one here, there might be some pushback to say, well, what do those freedoms mean? And how are they promoted? And how are we measuring the degree to which they are not being observed and complied with? And that is extremely important. Some of you will have seen, maybe you all spoke about it last night, about Vladimir Putin's address yesterday to a group of journalists, students, and others with his definition of what he thinks states mean. He says that there are sovereign states and there are colonies. And colonies, he says, for historians here, have no historical prospects, which should chill the blood even more than it already is. But it's clear that for Putin, what sovereign states mean is the United States, Russia, and China. Those are the states, great powers, that can coerce and can't be coerced. That is Putin's definition of what freedom means. The classic, very straightforward, the ability to act autonomously. And those others, the rest of us, Ulf put it more aggressively than I would have done, the United Kingdom, we in Europe, have had a relatively robust response, better than anyone could have expected, but behaving in a colonial fashion because we rely on goods, services, labour, ideas, energy, food, that are going to challenge some of these fundamental ideas about freedom that I will end my talk with. So the first question is Putin right? Is he right that globalized trade, the ability to have just-in-time supply chains, to be able to source goods from any part of the world cheaply, quickly, that has pushed costs down, has improved the life in the global south, not just economically, but in all the metrics that a scientist would measure: maternal health, infant mortality, literacy, clean water. Is he right? Have we built a global system that is fragile and super fragile? And one would be hard pushed, I think, to argue that those fragilities are not ones that should be keeping us all awake at night. There is something in this. Of course, a rational economist would say that Putin is wrong. All the benefits that have been flown around the world, not least knowledge economies. But it's clear to me that Russia and China and other states are not rational economists and are driven by dogma, are driven by political power that has been consolidated in their hands, and which brings with it, of course, their own fragilities with irrational baggage, with political dogmas and prejudices, and with the reward of a cabal and an interest group around the primary leader who needs to be rewarded. So those ideas, I think, should focus us quite hard. What is it we're actually fighting for, and how are we going to protect that? But this is not something that just traces back to the Enlightenment, because in the first instance, the reason why we became lovers of freedom and have built up the tradition of the last 200 or 300 years in Europe and its settler colonies and its settler appendages is not because men, they were all men, in the British Isles and in Europe in the 18th century were more reasonable or more rational or kinder or more sympathetic or more open-minded than their ancestors. It was highly selective. So rights were protected for men. I mentioned already about suffrage, but the purpose of why those rights were being taken was to do with Britain's role and Europe's role in establishing global trade-based economies that gave access to ideas, but also to materials. Sugar, which reduced the calorie amount that needed to be produced in Britain and in Europe. Cotton, saltpeter for our weapons, etc., and above all, manpower. That helped drive economic growth, helped push social mobility, and the primary factor of that was for newly rich mercantile elites to take power back from the crown, or to erode the ability of autocrats to be able to launch wars, to raise their own personal households above the needs of the state. And in Britain in particular, we were far better, I'm taking credit for this, the British were far more successful in the ways in which parliamentarians were able to force meetings of parliament compared to, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal were not able to meet and to successfully gather to try to put constraints on the ruler. The British Parliament was able to pass many, many more extraordinary taxes that reduced the ability of monarchs to have unlimited powers and to curtail autocratic decisions. And that in Britain is a very long part of, again, of its own long tradition, both of the Civil War, but also back to Magna Carta, which, despite how we might think about that, is all about elites trying to reduce the power of the sovereign and to take back control. So these freedoms about why it was that we emerged with this idea of freedoms and liberty in Britain were because we built institutions that protected those rights, in particular property rights, but also extended those into those small minority groups, but could be scaled. So eventually opening up to wider members, more men to vote, eventually to women, and then to erode some of those other things that are being taken away. So institutions are the key on which all freedoms are based. And it would seem to me that the fundamental problem in today's world, in the 21st century and in 2022 in particular, is to do with the failure of global institutions. So the reason we are where we are is because of the weakness of the United Nations and its many agencies, to do with the weakness of the WTO and even with the GATT Treaty of '94 that has specific provision, for example, to limit and restrict the amount of imports and exports that states are allowed to commit. As we sit here this morning, about 70% of global calories are under restriction of export. And that puts huge pressure on prices and, of course, will result in some catastrophic scenes later this year, unless we're mistaken. So institutional weakness, of course, at a global level and at a multilateral level, is why we've seen harvesting of power across multiple states. We've seen that, for example, with it's a very long list, but Erdogan in Turkey, who's now going to break the Turkish constitution to stand again, he announced yesterday, Xi in China, Putin quite clearly, Modi, the leader of the largest democracy on earth, who has not done a single press conference since he was elected in 2014. He attended one and refused to take a question. But so these ideas about what the challenge is for our freedoms is important. And to put that into some sort of shape and context, and I know, Ulf, you're going to get me to stop. At this time last year, or just over a year ago, General Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of the United States, rang his opposite number in China on the 6th of January to warn him and to say that if he was asked to begin a conventional or non-conventional strike on China, he would warn the Chinese first. So our vulnerabilities are withdrawal from Afghanistan, our soul-searching and forelock-tugging, our inability to act, our inability to reform and make those global institutions robust has given space for highly sophisticated actors. All those leaders I mentioned have been in power for a decade or more, in some cases, multiple decades, Erdogan and Putin, to allow for coercion to be able to take place easily and quickly. That is the fundamental pressure we're under, which, from my view as a historian, and we can argue about this over drinks, it's about how dangerous a point we are. My own view is that we're beyond where we were at any point in the 20th century, including the world wars, in terms of the things coming towards us. I would hope that some of the pandemic planning, some of the stuff that that John Bew did with the integrated review that I was part of too, is about trying to work out, and it is a very important final point, Ulf, about the protection of freedoms is all now going to rest on what the role that the state has relative to individuals. So when the integrated review was produced, some of the primary questions were things like the 5G spectrum, about rare earths, about raw materials. Now, the state is getting bigger and bigger because it has to respond to existential threats. And at that point, the main question for all of us, if we want to protect our freedom in our own states too, is who has the authority to make these decisions? How are they going to be validated and justified? And who do we prioritize first and who we protect? And those seem to me fundamentally critical problems that historians, policymakers, politicians should be thinking about. And if it was me, not sleep.
Thank you.
Done.